Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I am honored again to have the opportunity to introduce Ms. Daisy Freed. This week, she has a craft talk on coolness as poet in residence for Westchester University Poetry Center. Daisy Freed is an award-winning author of 3 collections, all published by the University of Pittsburgh Press. Women's Poetry, Poems, and Advice, named by Library Journal as one of the 5 best poetry books in 2013. My Brother is Getting Arrested Again, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and She Didn't Mean to Do It, which won the Agnes Lynch Starrett Prize. She has been awarded Guggenheim, Hodder and Pew Fellowships, a Pushcart Prize, and the Cohen Award from Ploughshares, and the Editor's Prize for the feature article from Poetry for Singing God Awful Muse about reading, Paradise Lost, breastfeeding, and the importance of difficulty. Recently, her poems have been published or are forthcoming in Best American Poetry, the London Review of Books, Poetry, PN Review, Zocalo, Threepenny Review, Poetry International, and many other journals and anthologies. She says that her most recent creative preoccupation has been writing versions of Baudelaire poems, finding intersections for their themes and imagery with contemporary life and in sometimes contemporary idiom. Currently, she is poetry editor for the literary resistance journal Scoundrel Time, occasionally reviews poetry for the New York Times and elsewhere, and is a member of the faculty of the Warren Wilson College MFA program for writers. She lives in Philadelphia. Freed's work has been praised for her brilliant use of humor, her keen attention to detail, her sharp critical eye, and her mastery of lyric as well as narrative modes. Critics such as Jason Gurriel at PN Review have praised Freed's most recent collection, arguing that women's poetry, quote, locates Freed as one of the masterful American poets of her generation. After her craft talk, we will have question and answer period. Please use the Q&A feature to ask questions. And if you do use the chat, the host, Cindy Pila, and myself will share your questions also. Also, we would like to remind you that we are selling her books online, and the link will be in the chat. And now, Daisy Freed. Thank you.
Good morning. So I am going to be lecturing, yes, on coolness, but like not how to be cool, because I'm not cool. But this is a lecture called Ice is Also Great and Would Suffice, which is a quote from the Robert Frost poem, Fire and Ice. And I'm looking at what is the use of coolness and dispassion in poetry. And let me just test, I am told I can share my screen and show you, here we go. These are the works I will quote from or read in full, and I'm just putting that up. There is I'm going to be talking about something called the Prison Dictionary, which is a lexicon made by prisoners, maximum security prisoners, with language, a kind of slang vernacular language from that environment. And you can download that at that link. Robert Frost's Fire and Ice, Marion Moore's Paper Nautilus, William Carlos Williams, the ball game can all be found at either the Poetry Foundation or poets.org. So feel free to, move on over there when I'm talking about those poems. Ross Gay's poem at the end, A Small Needful Fact, is also at poets.org, and I will be also sharing my screen just to show you some things about that poem. And but there's 2 poems, a Joy Katz poem and a poem by the poet I, which I could not find online in their present form. So I will be once again sharing my screen to show you those poems while I'm talking about them. Okay. So when I did a reading a few years ago at St. Louis University, my host invited me to read at a maximum security men's prison in nearby Bonne Terre, Missouri. Excuse me. The prison reading seemed obviously a good ethical thing to do, and it also attracted me, if I'm honest, as novelty and as material. But I thought that I probably wouldn't be able to manage to write a poem that would be both good and ethical after a brief, essentially touristic visit. Poems that turn other people's suffering into art have to be awfully good to justify their existence. At the prison, we went through a series of metal detectors, armored doors, and ID checks through lanes of barbed wire-topped chain link fencing that divides prison yard from prison yard. Grassy flatlands spread out all around, and the sun, though it was February, was strangely piercing. How's that for pathetic fallacy? In another building, a large gray room, someone said the door on the far side led to death row. My audience came through the other double doors. I remember them as swinging. Folding permission slips into their pockets and setting up metal folding chairs they took down off stacks on a trolley. For an audience of maybe 80 men, one of my bigger audiences ever, I did 2 20-minute poem sets with a Q&A between and a meet and greet afterwards. The men were polite, even courtly, even proprietary. A few knew something about poetry, most not so much, not unlike your average poetry audience. I got material all right, but when I tried to write down the people I met visiting the prison, everything I wrote seemed to trivialize human beings. I've cut paragraphs out of this lecture describing them because cast of characters, though they were, such stories as they told me, it seemed to me I've taken advantage of my access. You can get too exquisite with this kind of self-guilting, but every time I tried, what I wrote all seemed, at best, obviously written out of innocence, the helplessly despicable innocence of privilege. Some months later, my host in St. Louis, the poet Devin Johnston, sent me the Prison Dictionary, a lexicon of prison slang written by a group of Bonne Terre inmates taking part in a workshop, including some of the men that I met. And again, there's a free download, which hopefully you'll be able to get hold of. It's a really interesting book. Each of its 61 entries offers a brief utilitarian definition followed by a colloquial usage example. Skittles, noun, psychotropic medications. Prisoners are lined up for med pass to get their Skittles. Viking, noun, a person who chooses not to shower or clean up after himself. That man is a Viking. You could smell him stinking from 20 feet away. Jigger, verb, to look out for a correctional officer. Synonyms: to keep bust, look out. Would you jigger for me while I smoke? The Prison Dictionary shows me why I can't, so far at least, write a passable poem about my visit to Bonne Terre. Cell, verb, to live in a cell with someone. I can't cell with Tom. He lives like a Viking. Door warrior, noun, a prisoner, in particular in segregation, who stands at the door, yelling and screaming threats and insults to others in the wing. He's a real door warrior now that he's safely behind 3 inches of steel. House mouse, noun, one who lacks consideration for the personal space and or time of his cellmate. My cellie is a house mouse. I can never get any cell time. Boat, noun, a makeshift bed placed on the floor and used when the prison is overcrowded. It resembles a canoe and is typically made from plastic. Sleeping in the boat makes my back hurt. I was shaken by the visit, not by the people I met who seemed like, well, people. Jail, verb, to get along well with others, especially as a cellie, to possess a mature, responsible, respectful attitude. John is a good cellie. He knows how to jail. Convict, noun, an incarcerated individual who adheres to the criminal code, e.g. minding one's own business, not snitching, being willing to fight, and being willing to accept the consequences of the code, whatever they may be. Among the incarcerated, the label convict carries greater social esteem than inmate or offender. That old head is a real convict. I wouldn't call him an inmate. So what was I shaken by? I was shaken by leaving. After an hour and a half in the prison common room, that quick, I was shocked by the fact that I could leave, out through the rooms and gates and detectors and locked doors, and they couldn't. A physical shock of space and of agency resuming. If I could write about anything in relation to this visit, I might write about that, and I can do the journalistic work. This happened, though not much happened, but only as an onlooker. In a poem about other people's actions and other people's suffering, in a poem that, in other words, happens to other people, I believe you need more than a reactive, I feel bad, I was shaken, I'm angry, or even I'm glad. The sense that the living writer behind the work has feelings is probably essential to a poem. But maybe expressing feelings isn't really the point. How to develop a voice or tone for a poem about prison that does more than react. Here are some features of the prison dictionary that makes it good in ways I'd like poetry to be good. Its subject matter is interesting. Its creators wrote it from experience. I'm not purist about that sort of thing, the write what you know thing, but it does help. It's economical. Entries are short and efficient, conveying much in a few words. It uses metaphor, like house mouse, and metonymy, like old head. Noun, a prisoner who has been incarcerated for many years. That old head's been in here 40 years. There is narrative here delivered in fragments having to do with men under particular social and emotional conditions and stresses. The senses are engaged. There is a feeling of time passing, especially in entries dealing with length of sentence. Short, adverb, near the end of a prison sentence. He is 3 years short of his date. This conveys hope, the possibility of a change of fortune, while reminding us that actions have consequences. And the prison dictionary's mixing of dictions makes for dynamic shifts as the living spoken language interacts with flat utilitarian explanation. This turns out to be extremely expressive, without any fixed subjective observer expressing an opinion. Dispassionate prison dictionary is full of emotion: anger, humor, hunger, sadness, depression, mental illness, hope, despair. In other words, the prison dictionary does well what good poems do, and does it by creating possibilities for expression out of coolness, detachment, flatness, and information. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice, writes Robert Frost. You can find this poem by going to Poetry Foundation, I think, and putting in fire and ice, Robert Frost. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. I have also written about heat, outbursts, anger, urgent and upset tones in poems. And in fact, that may be where my poetic heart is. As I deliver this, I am wondering what sort of gnashingly furious poem I might be able to write, for example, about the Republicans trying to ram through the appointment of the anti-gay, anti-woman, anti-Affordable Care Act Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court in the few weeks before the next election, after blocking President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland 11 months before Obama left office. That might not sound like an obvious subject matter for a poem, but I think, the anger I feel over that feels like it would make a good poem. We live in an age of heat, and a poetry age that has returned us somewhat to the proclamatory poem, if that's the right way to say that. But an awful lot of poems I like or even love depend on coolness, dispassion, the anti-heroic. Ice is also great and would suffice. To allege flatness in a workshop is usually to level a criticism. To complain of coolness and irony in contemporary poetry is to take aim at tiresome hipsters who mostly deserve it and should be shot at dawn. But when is emotional flatness an engine rather than an error? What's exciting about lack of excitement? What are the ethical and expressive ramifications of coolness? How does a poem achieve dispassion? What is it for? We know from Marianne Moore that highly detailed, syntactically complex, seemingly impersonal poems can get at the tangles of human relationship. For example, the Paper Nautilus, with its animal correlative from maternal hindrance and protection, and that one's at poets.org. It's called The Paper Nautilus. I'm just quoting a couple of stanzas from it, though. For she is, in a sense, a devilfish. Her glass ram's horn cradled freight is hid, but is not crushed. As Hercules, bitten by a crab, loyal to the hydra, was hindered to succeed, the intensively watched eggs coming from the shell, free it when they are free, etc. And just as we know that from concrete details arises emotional association, we know that withholding detail can make much meaning. If as a rule, and this is in C.D. Wright's words describing William Carlos Williams, if as a rule every stick in the refuse emerged particular in William Carlos Williams' poems, Williams also understands the force, ethical and emotional, of leaving out the details. Thank you, Cherise. And so now and the William Carlos Williams poem is at Poetry Foundation. So sorry to be dashing ahead. But here I'm gonna read that whole poem to you. So while I'm reading it, perhaps we'll find it. So this is William Carlos Williams, The Crowd at the Ball Game. The crowd at the ball game is moved uniformly by a spirit of uselessness which delights them. All the exciting detail of the chase and the escape, the error, the flash of genius, all to no end save beauty, the eternal. So in detail they, the crowd, are beautiful. For this be warned against. Saluted and defied. It is alive, venomous. It smiles grimly. Its words cut. The flashy female with her mother gets it. The Jew gets it straight. It is deadly, terrifying. It is the Inquisition, the revolution. It is beauty itself that lives day by day in them, idly. This is the power of their faces. It is summer. It is the solstice. The crowd is cheering. The crowd is laughing in detail, permanently, seriously, without thought. So this poem is not about baseball. There are no hot dogs, no cheers, no stats, no thwack of ball into the glove, no dust rising as the runner slides home. We hardly see people either. They're a faceless mass out of which emerges temporarily a Jew and a flashy female who knows something more, something, quote, deadly, terrifying, laughing permanently, seriously, without thought. This has seemed to many a premonition of fascism, spring and all, in which these lines appeared, was published in 1923, which is the same year that Hitler attempted the beer hall putsch. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's the sort of when he first began rising to power. The poem comes late in Spring and All, close to a section of prose where Williams says that poetry, as distinct from prose, feeds the emotion, so he says poetry feeds the imagination, liberating words from their emotional implications, whereas prose feeds the emotion. So again, he's saying that poetry feeds the emotion. I'm screwing this up. He says poetry feeds the imagination and prose feeds the emotions. And this sounds kind of weird to us, right? It's a strange generalization. If you've ever sat in a poetry audience, you know, going, you know, and like reacting to emotionally to what you hear, many of us understand poetry to be declarations of sensibility, of expressions of heightened feeling, right? And that's what underlies lyric poetry. But I think that here there's a sense that with Williams' idea about poetry liberating words from their emotional implications, having to do with our sense of the word's own tactility, of the words themselves as material. And I think it's useful in thinking about the crowd at the ball game, the crowd that is moved uniformly by a spirit of uselessness which delights them and is in detail beautiful. And then he says again, for this be warned against, saluted and defied. Is Williams acknowledging detail's power to be manipulative? The crowd he delivers to us is mainly faceless, largely free of detail, and dangerous. The poem's very bareness, its flatness, is its engine, able to deliver a chill. Individuals with their messy and conflicting details complicate the matter. But the crowd at the ball game might as well be the faceless crowd at the Coliseum, the crowd that allowed the Holocaust to happen, the crowd of frat boys that gang rape drunk girls, the crowd of Americans that mindlessly allow Black men to be murdered by cops at astounding rates, the crowd on the internet that denounces and delivers mob justice summarily, the crowd that chants "Make America Great Again" without apparently realizing what damage they have already done to themselves, to millions and millions of Americans, to millions of people around the world, permanently, seriously, without thought. In her prose poem, I'm going to share Joy Katz's poem now. Let's see if I can do this. And I think Joy is in the audience. So I told her that if she thinks my reading of her poem is crazy, she should, I forget if I told her to let us know or don't let us know. But anyway, hi Joy. And I hope I've typed this up correctly as well. In her prose poem, In My Mother's 1935 American College Dictionary, Joy Katz uses her personal life as a mother, sometimes as a Jew, without writing anything resembling straight lyric. In my mother's 1935 American College Dictionary, between Holocene and Holocene, I come upon Holocaust. It sounds cross and bored, a child about to tantrum. Pestilence, locusts, I read. The Holocaust sits there humming like a bee box. From the Greek holocauston, I read, burnt offering, mad glare. Wholesale destruction. Little Holocaust kicks the kitchen chair. I decide to take the Holocaust around the town where I live. See, that's light, I explain. There are plants growing, whole yards, people, a calm world. From inside my jacket, that swarming sound. I walk the Holocaust carefully back to the car. I take it to see an action movie, thinking crashes and bombs will seem like family. It goes into the bathroom and sets the towels on fire. Should I bring the Holocaust home to show my mother? I do. She stops chopping onions for a minute. Don't let that thing get too close to the curtains, she says. On the street, the Holocaust tramples the flowers, eyes some old trees hungrily. It is a terrible nuisance. I hold it and let it beat its arms against me. So here, Katz treats a hot button topic, the Holocaust, with vivid dispassion, turning the word Holocaust into a bee box, then into a badly behaved toddler. The Holocaust, murderous history, becomes alien, a little dangerous, also containable. Katz refuses anger, lament, horror, the usual modes of treating this subject, modes which, as a fact, often fail. Expressing how she feels about the Holocaust, which may be personal history to her family, and for that matter, expressing how she feels about motherhood, is not Katz's goal. She seeks out lowercase Holocaust before it became the uppercase Holocaust, deliberately making it tiny. And when it comes to life, it is not mass murder, but a small child's wrecking naughtiness. The poem is about the experience of motherhood. And yes, motherhood does sometimes feel that bizarre, that demented. But I think it is also about the way we, in the present time, experience history 75 years old, generations and continents removed, about the Holocaust as industry, about the way the danger of such a thing happening again abides with us in our own selves, our own homes, our own lives and failures. The poem needs to be dispassionate to achieve this subject matter that does something other than feel bad about the death of millions. And it also requires strong feelings and freakouts to be transferred elsewhere than the self. Part of the poem's detachment comes of the outlandish yoking of mass murder to tantruming toddler, even if it's a toddler that plays with matches. That's imaginative spectacle, not primarily emotional engagement. Katz's coolness also takes place in her simple, non-committal verbs. I find, I walk, I take. Should I bring? I do. The closest Katz comes to emotional break is in I hold it and I let it. By contrast, the speaker's mother chops onions, violent gesture, causing tears, though significantly those are biochemical, not emotional tears. By contrast, again, Holocaust baby tramples and hungers, beats and destroys. If you've ever held a child in your arms who beats itself against you, you know that in order to quiet the child, you must detach yourself from your emotions, still, and defer them. You must let your stillness infect the baby. Is it ethical to make the Holocaust small as a baby? The speaker doesn't succeed in quieting baby Holocaust, however, inside the poem. She goes quiet herself. I walk, I go, I do, I hold it, and it beats itself against her. Where a poem that says, I feel bad about the Holocaust, may simply allow us to nod and turn away in calm agreement, who, after all, doesn't feel bad about the Holocaust. Katz's poem, by bringing the Holocaust into the home, by bringing the Holocaust into the home, turning it into a domestic urgency, and don't domestic urgencies trump all else in real life? Generating ersatz onion tears and failing to quiet Holocaust baby, this poem solves nothing, but in its coolness, shows much. All right, I'm going to keep sharing the screen, and we're going to talk about I's Family Portrait 1960. It is a little bit longer. It'll go on to the second page. It has one long stanza and one short one. Content warning, maybe sexual abuse. So just letting you know that I'm not sure if that's in the content of the poem or not. So this is I, Family Portrait 1960, was published in 1984. Sutton, my wife, says, excuse me, this is, in this poem, I strips the language way down to colloquial bareness. And in the tradition of, it's a dramatic monologue, and the speaker is a beleaguered father who reveals himself without knowing what he's revealing. Family Portrait 1960. Sutton, my wife, says, the girls won't wash between their legs. What am I supposed to do about it? I think, having just come in from buying round steak that I will try to tenderize with a mallet, then salt and pepper, dredge in flour and fry and serve with green peas, biscuits, gravy. But Stella, Peggy to her friends, yells from her bed, girls, go in the bathroom and take off your clothes. She leans back on her pillow, a box of Melba toast cradled in one arm, like a cardboard teddy bear, a barrier against the poverty and disappointment which have put her there. Colitis, doctor says. And where is this? One of those apartments with a courtyard in Los Angeles, where waitressing in cafe once, she served the guy from TV, Route 66, that is, coffee. But now I bring her coffee, bring her cigarettes, and pretend to sympathize. But now my daughters stand before me, wearing only shower caps. Rosalind, 7 years, thin and unpredictable. And Florence, 11, also thin and obedient to a fault. I hand them washcloths, soap, and shoo them in the shower. They stand in the water and wait for my commands. Go on, I say, you know how to start. Necks and shoulders, chests, backs, and bellies. Down they go, and in between the smooth, hairless entrances into themselves. You call that washing, I say, and lean forward on my toes, bend my knees and spread them. See, I say, and use my hand between my own legs, like this. Get in there, scrub your little pussies. After dinner, Florence washes dishes, Rosalind dries, Stella watches television, while I doze and chaos kept at bay lies down to sleep with us until daylight. So when I teach this poem to undergrads, half the class insists this is a rough around the edges but sweet family scene, and the other half insists that dad is molesting his daughters. Nothing much does happen. A man comes home, cooks dinner, expresses a little garden variety resentment while his wife sits on her ass. He sees the kids through the showers, and the family goes to sleep. So what do we have here? We have a switching of traditional gender roles, if noticeable even now, pronounced in 1960, dad doing the shopping, cooking, and childcare, mom sick with colitis, and or, as Sutton, the dad, thinks, with poverty and disappointment. Mom and daughters also change roles. Her box of Melba toast is significantly compared to a teddy bear, while the toast, mild food for irritable guts, is the kind of thing you might give a baby with a few teeth to chew on. While mom is babified, and since she's sick, we assume she and dad are not having sex these days, the girls are naked in front of their dad. This might be innocent. I mean, there has historically been a lot of nudism in my own house. We were mom, dad, and young daughter, though we got more modest as our daughter got closer to the age of Florence in this poem. And in this poem, it feels innocent, and to me, and then to me, it doesn't. Language changes as we get to the shower scene. Early on, dad lists actions as information. He comes in from shopping, will tenderize a steak, salt and pepper it, dredge it in flour, fry, serve it with green peas, biscuits, gravy. And even when he's expressing resentment, I bring her coffee, bring her cigarettes, and pretend to sympathize. It's straightforward information. Dad engages in some interpretation, though, and increasingly as the poem goes along. The toast box Teddy is a barrier against poverty and disappointment. Rosalind is thin and unpredictable. But does your readerly anxiety, like mine, rise when he describes Florence 11 as also thin and obedient to a fault? She's naked, she's wearing a shower cap, she's 11, near puberty, surely. What does it mean that she's obedient to a fault? What is she being obedient about? I thought she wasn't washing between her legs. What is she submitting to? To whom is she submitting? What happens next seems to be a cataloging of constituent parts, not unlike the recipe we got early in the poem, up here. In the kitchen, salt, pepper, flour, green peas, biscuits, gravy. Now in the shower, the body parts are at first even more neutral than the food because they're detached from verbs. The food was dredged, fried, and served. These are necks and shoulders, chests, backs, and bellies, simply listed. Note the casual balance of that line. Necks almost rhyming with backs. Necks and backs each yoked via and to a two-syllable word with the stress on the first syllable. Shoulders, bellies. Two phrases of 4 syllables each. Necks and shoulders, backs and bellies, are balanced on either side of the single syllable word, chest. It's neat, it's matter of fact, it's not caressing, is it? Though I guess it has to linger on the fulcrum word, chest. Though I guess he's forcing us to move our gaze downward along with his to the body part the girls won't wash. And that body part gets 2 whole lines to itself. Down they go, and in between the smooth, hairless entrances into themselves. And that's close to rhapsodic after the poem's brusque, flat, early colloquial tatter. And then just after, look what dad does with his hands in the guise of modeling proper washing. And what to make of the use of the sexualized term for female genitals applied to little girls allegedly unclean before hormones even set in. After the word pussies, there's a blackout, or really a whiteout, into stanza break and scene shift. The poem is in a hurry to close down now, in a hurry to normalize whatever it is that happens between shower and dinner. So pleasant family scene, a day come to its end, a few simple declarative phrases, Florence washes dishes, Rosalind dries, Stella watches television, I doze. Until that is, a small syntactical madness sets in. While I doze and chaos kept at bay, lies down to sleep with us until daylight. What? What? What lies down to sleep with us? It takes a few tries to parse it, but it seems to be chaos, but not simple chaos, chaos kept at bay. And there's a paradox here. Chaos is both at bay and chaos is sleeping with us. A sudden drastic shift from simple syntax and colloquial diction is to something tangled, paradoxical, and anarchic. Makes all the difference here. From colloquial flatness to something beyond flatness, something necessarily and extremely clumsy. If you try to get out of this poem certain of anything, syntax, set like a snare, won't let you go easy. Till daylight comes, which will bring no respite, just the whole routine we feel starting over again. So I thought flatness was my subject when I began writing this lecture, and that quickly changed to dispassion, which something encompasses more than just tone, I think. But when is flat writing actually good writing? Ross Gay is a poet, many of you may be aware of him, who does not exclude uplift from his poem. He has book titles including the words Unabashed Gratitude, and he just came out with a book called, I think it's called The Book of Delight, or Delights. And he is unabashed about finding positivity in unusual places. In A Small Needful Fact, and I think you may have read this one when it was making the rounds on social media, as it actually does every few months at least. In A Small Needful Fact, Gay writes about the news. A small needful fact is that Eric Garner worked for some time for the Parks and Rec Horticultural Department, which means, perhaps, that with his very large hands, perhaps, in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants which, most likely, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to grow, continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe. So Eric Garner, as you are probably aware, died at age 43 on Staten Island in the summer of 2014 after a police officer put him in a chokehold. Garner, a former horticulturalist for the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, who quit for health reasons, had a police record for assault, resisting arrest, larceny, and selling loosies, unlicensed cigarettes. None of these are a death penalty offense. And a reputation in his neighborhood for generosity, congeniality, and peacemaking. He had 6 kids, including a 3-month-old child and 3 grandkids. NYPD officers approached Garner on suspicion of illegally selling loosies. Garner told police he was tired of being harassed and wasn't selling cigarettes. They set about arresting him. One officer took Garner's wrist behind his back, and Garner, a big guy, swatted his arms away. The officer put him in a chokehold and pulled him to the ground, then removed his arm from Garner's neck and pushed Garner's face into the ground while 4 officers restrained him. Garner repeated, "I can't breathe," 11 times while lying face down on the sidewalk. After he lost consciousness, officers turned him onto his side to ease his breathing. An ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. He was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital about an hour later. Medical examiners ruled the death a homicide. In the wake of Garner's death, during demonstrations against police violence against demonstrations against police violence against African Americans, many protesters bore signs reading, "I can't breathe." The poem A Small Needful Fact performs a service. It is an act of retrieval of the man Garner from newsprint and television signal, social media, all of that, and also from being a rallying point for activists. Without being intimately biographical, it refuses to allow the man to be subsumed into the facts of his death or into public opinion about his death. It toys with an easy enough but compelling irony while doing so, that the man who died saying, "I can't breathe," made it easier in his life for other people to breathe. This is a poem made of information, inflected by verbal tics, by hemming and hawings, in all likelihoods, excuse me, in all likelihoods and perhapses. But if you isolate the poem's information, if you separate, in the words of the poet Roy Fisher, if you separate event from opinion, you get, you can ruin the poem this way, which is an interesting way to figure out why the poem in its correct format is absolutely necessary in its correct format. So if you isolate the poem's information, what you get is this first paragraph here. Eric Garner worked for the Parks and Rec Horticultural Department using his very large hands to plant things gently, plants which can live for years after one plants them, feed small and necessary creatures, are pleasant to touch and smell, convert sunlight into food, and make it easier for humans, that is all of us, to breathe. So I've just made the poem disappear, right? The only trace of imagination I've left in is the notion that his very large hands were gentle. Big men often have big hands, and people who deal with plants probably do need to be capable of gentleness. So let's take it as evidence. And then here's what I took out, this here. For some time, which means perhaps, in all likelihood, some, most likely, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to do what such plants do, like. In one line there is a prayer, continue to do what such plants do, and that's hopeless and hopeful. Garner can't continue. He's dead, but maybe society, maybe America can do what plants do, which is, among other things, grow. The rest of those lines might be the flattest, most boring set of words ever, all vagueness and circumlocution, indicating a speaker uncomfortable and also sometimes stuffy, perhaps instead of maybe, and good God, in all likelihood, twice. And in fact, all this hesitation and hedging makes the poem. With it, Gay characterizes his speaker as uncertain and uncomfortable. He hesitates, circles, hesitates again, feels something isn't right, knows just enough to draw a few conclusions, not personal ones. He's not mourning a friend. By refusing to pretend it's personal, by refusing to take on the other man's tragedy, by staying at harumping difference, perhaps, in all likelihood, the poem allows Gay and us to stand back far enough to see something important. Garner as human being, as worker, unsainted, unremarkable, yet in his ordinary workerliness, oxygen giving, a small thing that matters a little. And all those likes, 7 of them in all, 2 of those inside the word likelihood, here and here. And maybe the word likelihood contains a suggestive nearness to the word livelihood. And one like inside of likely, right there. Garner in Gay's poem is a likely fellow. When I get to the likes that crescendo and close the poem, I have the illusion that I'm reading simile. So I have the illusion that I'm going to be allowed the grace and escape of metaphor. Not so. Gay's like provides a simple list of untranscending comparisons. What do plants do? Things like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like be pleasant to touch and smell, like convert sunlight to food, like make it easier for us to breathe. There's a message in this poem, I guess, but it is not transformative. The likes take us nowhere, and nothing can ever change again for Eric Garner, or Philando Castile, or George Floyd, or Breonna Taylor, but what we see at the end is just a man who, unlike us, is no longer breathing. The poem's flat language is an act of trust and is what makes this an idealistic poem. Instead of trusting metaphoric leaps or originality or any sort of verbal sparks, it trusts flat, banal, utterly normal language. Maybe that makes it seem possible that banal, flat, normal humans can do better than we have been doing. I said at the beginning of this essay that a poem about other people's suffering has to be good to justify its existence. And Ross Gay has written such a poem. Thank you.
I'm muting and remuting myself. I'm muting myself. Thank you so much, Daisy. That was fantastic and thorough and provocative. we're going to open up for questions. Let's see, using the Q&A feature. Do you see the question from, I'll read the question Emma gives us, from Emma Piccinini. In terms of ruining the poem, it reminds me a lot of poetry that is written today that does not have those repetitive elements or pieces of figurative language that help it read like a poem. A lot of poetry today seems unintentional, as if people take a sentence and break it into stanzas without intention. How does this kind of poetry make you feel?
I'm trying to think about that. So you're thinking about poems that are structured without, that feel like they're structured without pattern, whether it's sound patterns or metrical patterns or image patterns, I think is probably what you're getting at. One of the things I would say is that it's probably true, and this is a generalization, but it's probably true that any good poem has some kind of pattern in it, which may not be a sound pattern or a metrical pattern. It may be a pattern of syntax, and it may be a pattern of refusing pattern, so that every little thing the poet does is refusing to engage with pattern. And I think probably a good poem that seems, if a poem feels like it's a good poem, it's probably going to have some kind of pattern that's detectable, that doesn't have to do with meter or some of the more obvious things. So I think all I'm saying is a good poem is a good poem and a bad poem is a bad poem, and there's and a lot of poems are in between, of course, but that when we sit down to analyze it, does it break its lines in interesting places? That's the kind of way of making pattern or anti-pattern, right? A good poem will simply have a pattern, but it won't be one that adheres to anything traditional, right? So that's a little bit of a general answer, but I think that's what I have to say about that.
Thank you.
And Joy, I will definitely send you my my paper, but is this also being recorded?
Yes, this is being recorded, and so we're hopeful to get it out there in the world on our website. But you'll be able to send Joy a link to this, definitely.
I'm seeing a question from Kenneth Wallace, and it says, "What made me want to be a poet?" I grew up in a house where my parents were readers. My father wrote poems, was actually even published in very good journals in his 20s till he gave it up for a while. And actually, he's now shopping around a manuscript again, so that's kind of nice. But I think the sort of literature was always, and reading was always in my life. I didn't. I wrote poems as a teenager, you know, in my journal and stuff like that. Maybe I sent some to my high school literary journal. I took a workshop. I've only ever taken one full-length workshop in my life with Natalie Anderson at Swarthmore College, which is wonderful. When I was an undergraduate there, it was a wonderful workshop. So there's always some way I was engaged in writing poetry, but eventually I worked as a journalist in my 20s, was most of the writing that I did. The rigor and the deadline of writing journalism gave me a kind of discipline. And I started to be more disciplined about my poetry, and I got less interested in journalism, more interested in poetry. And so I found myself being a poet, Kenneth. I don't know that I ever wanted to be a poet, but it turned out I was one. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. That's the arc of development, you know, for poets. Your story is really interesting for that. I'm wondering, while we're waiting for another question, I'm trying to piece together a question after hearing you talk about your background in journalism. Do you think that these days, because you said we're in a kind of a shrill and highly sort of energetic time where there's so much happening and there's so much to say, do you think that that journalistic distance also is helpful? Because, well, so many people in the media don't even have it anymore, but like, is that a place for poets to sort of like kind of hang back and reflect and also kind of have that coolness to be heard in a different way?
Well, I think that in very different ways, journalism and poetry both want to get at some kind of truth, right? Mm-hmm. And you really can't have the reporting of events and facts without a slant. I think journalism has a goal to be objective, but it's really not going to happen. I think that we try to act in America as though journalism is supposed to be objective and not have a political opinion, and I think that that's impossible to do. Writing itself, creates perspectives and creates opinion. While I think there's responsible journalism and responsible narration of facts, I don't think the goal of absolute objectivity is attainable, really, which is why we do need responsible voices from all sides of the spectrum. And the problem right now is that there are extremely irresponsible voices engaged in journalism, right? And in poetry, it's interesting. You even if I hadn't been going on in my lecture about political stuff several times, and even if I hadn't been sipping from my Joe Biden mug, you could probably guess who I'm going to vote for in the upcoming election and where my political viewpoints are. But I tend to think that poetry is not a very good format for editorializing. So that I don't think, there are really good political poems that urge people to behave better, right? But I do think that a good political poem is often one that also is able to include complexity and include the individual coming into contact with the public, right? I think that poetry is really good at getting at unresolved contradictions, So I think poems that I think I might be getting way off what your initial question, Charisse, but I think that poems with a kind of political weather can be very vital without being editorializing. But you had asked about dispassion. I think we need to be honest at what we see, and I feel like I want to write the honest poems in that I don't want to oversimplify things. I don't want to make things seem more simple than they are. And so you have to have a dispassion about things in order to perceive things in their complexity. I want to, I believe this about Trump, I believe this about these things, but it's not going to be very interesting in a poem. So if I step back and try to put more things together, more complicated and conflicting things together, that might make a better poem.
Sure. Thank you. We have a couple of more questions and a little bit to wrap things up a little bit. So I'll take this question from Associate Dean Yoon. She says, I fear that if I wrote that final stanza by I, it would have been workshopped out, that readers or my own internal editor would insist on a cleaner end. How do you get poems like Eyes or Gaze to survive?
That is such a great question, right? Because the instinct in the workshop is to clean up things, to make them more orderly. But I think it's important to a lot of times one of the things that shows up in workshop is someone will have a draft of a poem where there's like a really weird moment in the poem that kind of sticks out with like the elbow sticking out of the poem, right? And oftentimes someone will say, well, this doesn't fit with the rest of the poem. And at that point, I will usually kick in a teacherly way, and I'll say, well, there's two things you can do with something that sticks out of the poem like that. you can edit it out, or you can work with it some more and explore that. Why did that get in there? Why does that, is that where the poem wants to go? So, there are poets who are brilliant when being very orderly and elegant, and so many poets, and there are other poets whose very messiness and disorderliness is their engine and their brilliance. And I think that what we do as writers is we just keep on writing and finding out what an individual poem wants to be. Like, maybe I write a really neat poem sometimes, and sometimes I write a really messy poem. I can do both, right? But temperamentally, this was actually, I like to tell this story if I have time. When Zadie Smith wrote her first novel, White Teeth, she came to Philadelphia, and she was in this big 215 festival, and somebody asked her, who are your favorite writers? Now, Zadie Smith's novels are big and sprawling and full of hilarity and detail. I mean, at that time, people were saying she's like the 20th, I think it was still the 20th century Dickens, right? That big, that multi-layered. And she says, well, one of my favorite writer is Raymond Carver. And we know Raymond Carver as this completely edited down, austere, no details, right? Like really spare minimalist writer. And she said, which that sounds really weird, right? But for Zadie Smith to love Raymond Carver, and she says, so I love him, but I know my own temperament. Like, you have to know your own temperament. And we start to discover our own temperaments. I'm in my 50s now, I know something more about my own temperament than I did when I was an undergrad. We find that out and we work with it. And what you don't want to do is, I think the goal of writing and revising is to revise towards yourself, towards your personality and the way that you personally interact with the world, not towards some external ideal of perfection, because that doesn't exist. It's bullshit. So.
Yes, indeed it is. Thank you so much. There's some people who have other questions and we're running out of time. And what we might do is, if people want to ask you those questions, would you be interested in continuing that chat on Facebook in some way? Or if they want to, maybe not now, but at some point, or?
I'd be delighted to. We could go on the Facebook page for the Westchester Poetry Center. I think that's a great idea. So, I don't know how to. Why don't you let me know how to do?
We'll do it. Yeah, we'll. I hope either Cindy or I or Seth will capture the questions and make sure we get them up there before we end. We close out our chat. And that way people can still feel as though they've been heard and been in conversation with you. You have such lovely answers that we want to make sure that that we're not rushed and all of that.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, there's my cat. That's what people
shout out to Felix and Huck and Puck were somewhere, I'm sure, in the distance nearby. It's so funny. So thank you, Daisy, for that incredible talk. We invite you to join us for Daisy Freed's next public lecture, her second craft talk, Singing in the Dark Times, November 4th at 4:30 p.m. I'm going to try to pull that up. And also for her, this is the thing about screen sharing, you got to have it. And I'll just put those up at the end. And also on Thursday, November 19th at 7:30, we will host the reading that will close Ms. Freed's residency. We hope that you will join us for all public events. Look for the announcement on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, as well as on our own WCU Poetry website. On our website, you'll find information about the Iris and Spencer Undergraduate Poetry Awards, deadline February 1st, 2021, the Will Mills Chapbook Award, and the Donald Justice Prize. Deadline November 15th coming up. On Friday, November 6th at 7 p.m., we will be hosting 12 poets reading their work from our launch party for Show Us Your Papers, an anthology edited by Daniela Buccilli, Wendy Scott Paff, and myself. This spring, our upcoming events include Crafting the Classroom in February with Black feminist poet and novelist Zetta Elliott will be our keynote speaker. And our spring poetry reading in March 2021 will feature Jan Beatty, director of the Mad Women in the Attic Creative Writing Workshops and director of creative writing at Carlow University. We will be ending our 2021 academic year with the launch of WCU Craft Fest, a virtual poetry and arts festival in April. Please stay in touch with us to find out more about our new and exciting programs. Daisy Freed's books are available for sale at our SSI bookstore website, and we've been sharing the link, and it is still available. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the incredible teams that I have the pleasure of working with, particularly those in these times of remote labor and Zoom meetings. Having this network is a blessing. I'm so grateful for the work of so many people. I want to start with my team at the College of Arts and Sciences, our Poetry Center, Emma Piccinini, Cindy Pila, Seth Birch. These two have made the magic happen in so many ways, especially in our Zoom world. I'm grateful for the support of Senior Associate Dean Kay Hagen-Yoon and Dean Jen Bacon. I'm thankful for the publicity that Christine Kozich has disseminated on behalf of the center. The Poetry Center is supported by the Faculty Advisory Council and the Poetry Center Advisory Council. David Urbani at the SSI Bookstore has been a tremendous resource, and my colleagues in English, especially the chair Aaron Hurt and our administrator Sarah Paler, have done an incredible job supporting the center. President Fiorentino's office has provided invaluable leadership during these challenging times, and I would like to express gratitude to my family as well as my vast supportive network of neighbors and friends who whose energy I continue to rely upon every day. Please, heartfelt thank you for all. Please join me as I thank Daisy Freed for this incredible craft talk. As a director of the WCU Poetry Center, I am so very grateful to each of you for joining us this morning. I look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you.